And that's a blank screen. There we are. Hello, everybody. We are now live. This is the New York Review of Science Fiction Readings. I have lost track of what season we are in. It's like the 32nd or 33rd, something like that. I was very upset last night when I realized, this being May, that Hour of the Wolf, my radio show, or not even that, that I began working at WBAI 56 years ago. And that is definitely a cry for help. But this is not that. This is New York Review of Science Fiction Readings, and we are still virtual, and I am intending on keeping it virtual until they say, oh, no more summer variants or anything like that. Uh, but unfortunately, the news says otherwise. Politicians, they're all like gung ho, go out, and the medical people are saying, don't talk to me without a mask. So there it is. But we have uh, okay, next month, we just booked Sarah Pinsker. So first Tuesday of next month will be the 6th. And I'm doing a pop-up Hour of the Wolf like I did with Kat very recently, with Kat Howard, our guest tonight. But this one will be this Friday at 2 o'clock New York time with Susan Emschwiller, who has a very cool new book out. And well, that's for Friday. Today with us is Kat Howard. This has been like Kat Howard fortnight for me because we put up the pop-up Hour of the Wolf that she did uh, about 4 days ago, and last week we broadcast an edited down version of the show, and then tonight, happily, she is our guest here, and that is due to promoting her book, A Sleight of Shadows. Sleight is Sleight, as in like something you might do with a deck of cards. And her official bio. Kat Howard is a writer of fantasy, science fiction, and horror who lives and writes in Minnesota. Her latest novel, A Sleight of Shadows, completes the unseen world duology begun in An Unkindness of Magicians. Her novella, The End of the Sentence, co-written with Maria Davana Headley, was one of NPR's best books of 2014. And her debut novel, Roses and Rot, was a finalist for the Locus Award for Best First Novel. An Unkindness of Magicians was named a Best Book of 2017 by NPR and won a 2018 Alex Award. Her short fiction collection, A Cathedral of Myth and Bone, uh, collects work that has been nominated for the World Fantasy Award, performed as part of selected shorts, and anthologized in year's best and best of volumes. She was the writer for the first 18 issues of the Books of Magic, part of DC Comics' Sandman universe. And now this says her next novel, her current novel, published late last month, A Sleight of Shadows, the sequel to An Unkindness of Magicians, was okay. That's weird. It says her next novel was published in April 2023. So somebody's got to check copy here. You can find her at Cat with Sword on Twitter and Instagram. And she talks about books at Epigraph to Epilogue. And I forgot to mention another part of my Cat Howard fortnight was that last Thursday on Lightspeed Magazine podcast, I got to host a short story of hers, which I also edited the audio. Is Kat on screen yet?
She's coming.
And there you
Hello.
are. Hi.
Hi.
I have to say that story from and Lightspeed. That was a knockout.
Thank you. I'm so glad to hear that.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it, and I get to spend more times with those stories because I'm editing the audio. And to edit a short story, what was that? Like 3,000 words, 3,500 words,
Actually, about 22 is pretty short.
a mere 22. Okay,
Yep.
but but nevertheless, I spent about 4 to 5 hours editing it. So,
Well, thank you.
uh,
Thank you very much.
and I'm always careful when I tell people that I edited somebody's story because I mean audio edit. John Joseph Adams was the editor on that
And
particular story. And so last we spoke was for Hour of the Wolf in the same
yes.
place, uh,
Amazing how that happens.
isn't it? And that was a lot of fun. And but between then and now, the book has actually launched.
It
It's out,
has.
and I personally haven't looked at the reception of it, although from your smile, it was pretty good.
I think so. I try to keep away from the review counts and stars and all the rest of that, just because that way lies madness. But
Yeah.
I was really lucky. There's a great indie bookstore very local to me, Next Chapter Books, and they hosted a launch party for the book, which was lovely. And some good friends were there, and so I've heard from some people I was hoping to hear from who enjoyed the book, and so I feel pretty happy about it. And it's nice to have it out in the world.
Yeah, and I loved it. I thought it was great. I was just a little shocked to realize that it was a duology and that ended the series.
It did. It's done.
Okay, and no peripheral stories or anything
No
in that
peripheral
universe.
stories, no spin-off characters, no nothing. The thing that I am currently working on is something completely different. So,
Okay. Uh, I guess and what we should do is get to the reading
okay.
pretty early. But so what I'm going to do, since we're into the second book
Mhm.
of the duology, and it works, by the way, in that way because the first book's a little longer,
Yep.
and so it's sort of got that nice act one and act two thing. Act two is always like strong and shorter, and this fits that very nicely. Is there and together these two books with two great titles, I mean, an Unkindness of Magicians and very big on collective nouns.
So am I.
And
Yeah, that was fun.
yeah, and A Sleight of Shadows um, are the unseen world,
Yes.
singular world.
Correct.
And is there anything that you care to tell us before we delve into the shadows?
Well, I'm going to read the first chapter of A Sleight of Shadows. So I think anything that I would want to tell the audience is probably going to be covered in the chapter. So I think maybe to avoid being repetitive, I think we could just jump in.
Okay, fair enough.
Okay.
And and there is an audience, of course, and they can always ask questions
Absolutely. Yes.
toward the end of this session. So begin when you will.
Okay. Well, thank you so much. And thank you to the audience. I so appreciate you guys being here. As I said, this is the first chapter of A Sleight of Shadows. The woman sitting at the table cast no shadow. She should have. The light in the apartment drew gray veils from the coffee cup, empty, on the counter, the chair in which the woman sat, the small white candle in front of her. It had been just over 7 weeks, 53 days exactly, since Sydney had given up her shadow in the final challenge of the turning, since she had asked Berenice Tenebrae to cut it from her body so she could sacrifice it to keep magic in the world. In that time, she had grown accustomed to the lack of her shadow. It had been strange, at first, the absence. The first few days there had been a constant sense that something was missing. The half breath before she put a name, again, to what wasn't there had felt, each time, stretched and strained. But her shadow wasn't her only loss. It wasn't even the most important one, merely the symbol of what had been given up. When Sydney sacrificed her shadow, she sacrificed her magic. And even now when she no longer reached for a spell in the same way that she used to, the automatic way that blood moved through her veins and breath moved in her lungs, she didn't need to be reminded that that ability was gone. That absence, that absence was a constant ache. It lingered in her scars and in her bones, in the places where magic had been cut out of her. The loss was a reminder of what she had been. Magic had been her entire life. It was her earliest memory, her first, her primary purpose. It was what she had been shaped for. It became the edge against which she honed herself, the means to all her ends. It had been hers, solely hers, not a weapon for the House of Shadows to use as it pleased, for so little time before it was gone. She wanted it back. She had a starting point, one remaining scrap, not enough to do anything that she couldn't more easily accomplish by flipping a switch, not enough to distinguish her from a mundane person who'd been lucky enough to wander into one of the kinder corners of the unseen world, and who had enough determination to remain there. She could still light a candle. She had just enough magic to give her hope. It was a cruel hope, one as sharp as the knife that had cut away her shadow and her magic, an ache to match the absence. But leaning into the sharp edge of the impossible was what she knew. Sydney shook off her thoughts and focused on the candle in front of her. A small white tea light in a battered tin, the kind that was sold in bags of 100 and smelled vaguely of vanilla and plastic. Simple, basic. Her first bag was nearly empty. She had others. Sydney spoke the word that kindled the spell, and the candle lit, just as it always did. Even the first time after the loss of her shadow and her magic with it. In that flickering moment, she had burned too. Burned with the hope that she had been wrong, that her magic wasn't gone, that everything would go back to normal. It hadn't. Not that day, and not any of the days since. An ache throbbed behind her eyes, and the taste of smoke coated her throat, the after effects of using magic making themselves known. They came on quicker now, one more reminder that things had changed. Sydney focused again. Magic required preparation in a way that it never used to. Breathing in, she twisted her left hand, bent two fingers sharply. This was the second spell she had tried every day, the spell that would extinguish the candle she had just lit. Pain like fire licked along the frayed edges where her shadow had been cut away from her body. A phantom blade sliced its way across her bones, tracing over the places where her magic had once been carved out of her. The candle flickered, dimmed. Sydney gritted her teeth against the pain and waited, watched, held her focus. Blood dripped from her nose. The candle guttered and went out. Sydney scrubbed her blood from the kitchen table and threw the extinguished candle in the trash. Once was nothing. Coincidence. A draft in her apartment, an errant exhale. The pain where her shadow had been merely the itch of an amputated limb, the timing coincidence. Nothing more. She couldn't let it be more, not without proof. She took another candle from the bag, set it on the table. She breathed in, spreading her awareness throughout her body, searching for anything that felt like magic, for anything that felt like change, for anything different at all. But there was nothing new, nothing beyond what she felt every time she cast this spell. Herself, and the absence where her magic had been. She spoke the word to light the candle. It flared, a column of fire stretching almost to her ceiling, melting the wax in the tin into immediate nothingness, then extinguishing. The edges of her shadow white hot, as if they were being carved away by a thin knife. Sydney placed her hands flat on her table, fingers starfished around the burnt-out, consumed candle. She breathed out. Her phone rang, one of the few numbers she promised always to answer. Grace, it's not really a good... Grace's voice thin and tight. Sydney, something weird is happening. I'm in a car outside. You need to come now. The end of the turning had seen House Prospero elevated to the head of the unseen world, which meant that, as well as the responsibility for House Prospero itself, would have been Sydney's had she not sacrificed her magic. She had been prepared to die in the course of the turning, and her fight against the abomination that was the House of Shadows, and so Sydney had named Grace Valentine her heir. For the unseen world, the loss of magic was equivalent to death. She had not anticipated the circumstances of Grace's inheritance, but remained confident in her choice, especially now that she had seen Grace in her role. She felt more sorrow than she had expected to over the loss of House Prospero, not for herself so much as for the house, which had genuinely tried, in the short time it had been hers, to be a place of welcome and refuge. But the house loved Grace as well. She had no regret at all over not being forced to be in charge of the snarl of egos and entitlement that was the unseen world. If that had been left up to her, she would have undone the whole thing. She had thought about leaving after the dust of the turning had settled, getting out of New York, away from the unseen world. It might have been better, easier, had she gone away and not looked back. But she hadn't even lived outside the House of Shadows for a full year. Everything, everyone she knew was here. Every time her finger hovered over the button to buy plane tickets, leaving had felt like one loss too many. And so here she was, sitting in the back of a cab with Grace, on her way to something weird. Windshield wipers thunked against the glass as tires whirred over rain-slick streets. The car's defrost, the driver had assured them, only worked when the air conditioner was on, as it was now, at full blast. The cold air settled into Sydney's joints, and she wished she had grabbed a warmer coat. "So when you say weird," she began, suspecting already what the answer would involve. Magic, of some sort, doing something that skewed beyond unexpected and into alarming. She wasn't quite sure why that meant she was needed, but Grace wasn't prone to drama, so if she wanted Sydney with her, Sydney would trust that there was a good reason. "It'll be easier to explain once we're there. I wouldn't have believed it if I hadn't seen it myself." Tension held Grace in rigid lines. She had cast a series of spells as Sydney got in the car, to prevent the driver from overhearing them, to clear a path through traffic. She had tried to redirect the air conditioning as well, but it really was stubbornly connected to the defrost. Nothing good, then. Sydney's hands still ached, as if she had been casting far more complicated spells than a simple candle flicker. She curled them into fists to stop the shaking, pressed her fists into her thighs. No, nothing good. They rode the rest of the way in silence. The scope of the nothing good began to unfold itself as the car stopped at Central Park. The two women raised umbrellas, and Sydney kept pace as Grace walked towards the reservoir. She knew the path, had walked it again and again at the behest of the House of Shadows, then on her own once she had finally broken free. She had walked this way when she came to destroy the House of Shadows, to render it into rubble and free the sacrifices held inside, and then when she had made the mistake that had led to her own undoing, when she freed Shara from the island that bound her. She had not come this way since. They rounded the path, and she saw. What in the actual fuck? Not a question, a flat statement of disbelief, stark enough to freeze Grace's hand partway through an unveiling spell. "You can see it? It's not veiled." The House of Shadows, the island it stood on, had been hidden before, magic drawn over it to keep it from mundane sight. "It is, Sid, the spell's in place." Had it been anything else, anything other than that island, full of the bones of the sacrifices who died in the House of Shadows, their magic carved out of them, that island where now, somehow, walls were once again rising in pieces out of the dirt, Sydney might have found the fact that she could see through the spell interesting, as a data point. She might have paused to wonder what it meant. But as soon as the thought crossed her mind, she knew. It wants me to see it. Unable to move or look away, she watched as broken stone slid across barren ground. How? She had left the House of Shadows in ruins, pulled it apart, unmade it with her magic, separated stone from stone. She had left it for dead, and somehow it was resurrecting. "Magic," Grace said, "and I mean that as literally as possible. As far as I can tell, Shadows is rebuilding itself. Not because of outside magic, because the pieces of the spell that created it are trying to come back together." Magic wants that place to come back. Bile rose in Sydney's throat along with the words, but even as she spoke, the thought made a kind of sense. Shadows had always had its own strange kind of agency. It had been capable of changing shape and altering its dimensions on a whim. Magic, Especially big, long-running spells like the ones that had animated the House of Shadows had a sort of memory. They wanted to continue. That kind of magic meant not just pushing against entropy, but turning it inside out and backward, and made order become preferable to chaos. And magic never particularly cared how it was used, only that it was. Can you feel it? Sydney asked. When Grace had become the head of the unseen world, the houses had mapped themselves onto her body. She could feel their presence, the warm hum of connected magic. No, I can't. That's good at least. If anything about this can be said to be good. Sydney, I hate asking, but I need you to come out there with me. You know that place better than anyone. Sydney wanted, very much, to feel as if she could refuse. I should have sunk that place when I left it. Grace called a boat from the depths of the lake. This summoning was different from the one Sydney had used to ferry herself back and forth when Shara had compelled her presence, but it was still similar enough to cause her to shudder as she stepped aboard. This was not a journey she had ever thought to make again, even with magic. Without... She set her jaw and forced her spine straight. She didn't have the luxury of weakness. The water was a dull, echoless pewter as Grace and Sydney sailed over it to where the House of Shadows once stood. As they drew closer, Sydney could hear the groan and scrape as its ruins tried to refit themselves. The sound was a nauseating wrongness. I hate this place. Everything about it. Even the ground feels haunted, Grace said as they stepped ashore. That wouldn't surprise me, Sydney said. The House of Shadows literally sat on bones. There are bodies all over the island. Grace froze mid-step, then set her foot down very delicately. What? All of the sacrifices, all of the magicians who died in shadows, they're buried beneath the foundations. Bones hold magic. Shara wouldn't have let that go to waste. Service to the house would last until it had extracted every scrap of magic that it could. I hadn't thought about that, but of course it makes sense, and is fantastically creepy. Grace looked askance at the ground and then continued walking. Did you expect anything different from this place? No, I can't say that I did. The wind blew hollow, bitter and harsh, scattering dirt and detritus everywhere, reaching beneath the hem of Sydney's jacket, into her sleeves. Shadow's rebuilding didn't look organized, at least not that she could tell. Chunks of ruins heaped together here and there, hulking up out of the ground at random, rather than in straight-lined walls. It didn't look like a house, didn't look like a building. Not yet, anyway. Still, it shouldn't have been happening at all. The magic's so sticky and thick that I feel like I'm walking through spiderwebs, Grace said. Everything clings. I can taste it. It clogged Sydney's throat, dry as dust, arid. This is different than it was before. That's what I thought, but I wasn't sure, and Grace swallowed the rest of the sentence. And I know shadows better than anyone, Sydney finished for her. She had lived there almost her entire life and been bound to the place even after she had left, had been one of 2 magicians ever to earn her freedom from that binding, had been the one who had known shadows well enough to break it. Now she was broken, and the House of Shadows was unbreaking itself, and that was even more bitter than the magic clogging her throat. That she could sense the magic this intensely felt like another kind of torment, like the house wanting her to. She hadn't lost her ability to sense magic when she lost the ability to cast it, but this, being surrounded like this, it felt like a kind of gloating. The ground shifted under her feet as she walked, as if the reverberation of her steps through the layers of soil and bone disturbed them, as if the bones of the dead were reaching up for her in response. She placed her feet carefully. When Shadows had been whole, when she had been its prisoner, one of its favorite tricks had been to open the floor beneath her and send her plummeting. It had been one of the first ways she had learned to fight shadows, to pit her will against that of the house and force her way out of where it had dropped her, back to some temporarily safer place. She pushed a loose piece of stone from a broken wall, listened to it crack and rattle as it fell to the ground, waited for it to crawl its way back to where it had been. But the stone stayed where it had fallen, and the next scrape of ruin over earth was 2 different hunks, a broken stair and what might have been a window or a door frame coming together. Have you tried using magic to stop the rebuilding? Sydney asked. The ground moved beneath her again. Not a tremble so much as a heartbeat, soft, regular. Flickers of white, like candle flames, sparked at the edges of her vision. Grace nodded. It rebuilt as soon as I took it apart. fast, almost like it fed on the magic I used. Sydney swore, low and viciously. Agreed, Grace said. I don't know what to do, Sydney. Neither do I. Grace shivered in the cold. The rain's getting worse. We should go. Sydney stared back over the ruins and shook her head. I should have drowned this place. But she wondered, as the boat ferried them back to the opposite shore, as she heard the echoing scrape of rock over bone recede behind her, if even that would have been enough. There is a fountain at the heart of Central Park with a statue of an angel rising from it. Designed by Emma Stebbins and dedicated in 1873, she is called the Angel of the Waters. She holds a lily in her hand and was commissioned as a sign of blessing, of healing powers, of an end to the plague of cholera that had ravaged the city. The statue is very recognizable, the showpiece of the elegant Bethesda Terrace at the heart of Central Park. It is a favorite spot of film crews craving a picturesque location shot and of lovers who wish a romantic setting to exchange promises in. A symbol as resonant as that has its own kind of inherent magic. In the more recent past, that magical resonance had been taken advantage of, and the angel used as a magical anchor for some of the foulest spells the unseen world had known. She was made a conduit for the theft of power, a channel for suffering. She had crumbled under the weight of those spells and been repaired only by their end. And so once restored, she was also a symbol of promises made and promises broken, and power no one should have. For those who knew how to look, for those who were willing to see. For most people, even for the magicians who should have known differently, she was only a statue. For a brief time after the statue was made whole again, it seemed as if things might have truly changed, as if the unseen world might heal and grow into the better thing some hoped it could be. But then, one night, not long after the broken ruins of the House of Shadows began to put themselves back together, magic coursed through the statue again. A new magic, but one familiar in its foulness. The spells of the House of Shadows reaching out and attempting to reestablish themselves. Overwhelmed, the lily cracked and fell from the hand of the angel. That offering of hope, of peace, of continued growth in new life, shattered. That shattering was not the only piece of strangeness to occur that night. Even as the wind scattered bits of the broken statue, a group of trees stretched and rose from the earth throughout Central Park. They unfurled into full growth almost as soon as they broke free from the soil. At the heart of each tree was a bone, a human bone, a piece of those who the trees had once been. Whisperings rose with them, the trees speaking their memories, memories of loneliness, abandonment, of a house made of shadows and magic sharp as knives, of pain and then of death. It was a heartbreaking, haunting sound. The mournful voices of the trees were an ache to listen to, a veil of grief draped over skin. They permeated the park, inescapable. Magic clouded the air like fog. Something was beginning. Thanks.
And hello.
Hello.
So that was cool. That was nice. I like
Thank
that.
you.
So one of the questions
Mhm.
that I had just slipped my mind. I've been like this for like a week now. Just my clogged head. But oh yes, uh, your New York is
Mhm.
very informed, even though you live halfway across the country.
Yes.
How is it that you know New York so well?
um, I've never lived there. The closest that I ever got to living there was living out on Long Island while I was doing some postdoc work. But it was close enough for me to get into the city, and I loved New York City. I absolutely fell in love with it, and so I came in whenever I could. So that was part of it, and some of it is, research is a really useful tool. And I did, like internet research for streets and maps and locations and things like that. Probably a lot of the time because I'm very, very bad at streets and maps and geographic location. But I also like, books on the history of New York City and its waters, and like a stack of research that wound up, 99% of it not being relevant to the book, but it built up the place in my head, and helped me
Mhm.
get it on the page. So
Yeah, and also, I mean, you name some of my favorite restaurants in there, although you missed Wool Hop, I think.
I think I
And
did.
yeah, you named a different place in Chinatown, which is also pretty good. But uh, now, uh, one thing that I think people listening to just this excerpt might not have picked up on
Mhm.
is the turning.
Okay, yes. So in An Unkindness of Magicians, the most of that book is structured around what's called the Turning, which is a magical duel for power and prestige that happens in the unseen world about once every generation. Although the part of the issue in Unkindness is that it's happening early for some yet to be determined at the beginning of the book reason. Um, it starts out as sort of someone put it as magical duels at cocktail parties, and I kind of loved that description. And that is really what it
Yeah.
starts out at. It's very civilized. It's who has the best, most powerful, most impressive magic. And then it turns into duels to the death. So the way that you get power in this world is by being willing to, kill your friend that you've been at school with for your entire life, and that's definitely going to work out fine for everyone. No one's going to be traumatized by this. Um, and it's basically a last person standing kind of deal. And so that is that battle, that magic, that competition for who's going to be where, and what houses are going to be powerful is sort of the running frame of the first book. And it ends pretty poorly for a number of people.
Yeah. Yeah. Although I would say a lot of, at least the people I care about, sort of have their lives straightened out in the second book, in the Sleight of Shadows.
That was the hope. That was part of the reason for coming back for a sequel was I was unhappy with how I had left things for some of the characters that I liked. So
Yeah. Uh, how much time was there between your finishing Unkindness of Magicians and the Sleight of Shadows? How long did you spend?
okay, so the timeline was I didn't know I didn't know that I was going to write a sequel. I thought Unkindness was standalone. So that was written and it was done. It was out in arcs to first readers and everything else. And then I was talking with my editor Joe Monty, who by the way asked me to say hi to you. Hi from Joe Monty.
Now,
Um,
hi to Joe, who was, by the way, a curator of the Nursif readings for 2 years before he
um,
became somebody.
but we were talking about what the next book would be, and I'd heard from a couple of early readers that the sort of, hey, so when are we getting the next one kind of response. And I was like, so if I was going to write a sequel, would you be interested in a sequel? And he was like, yes, I would be interested in a sequel. In fact, I would pay you money to write it. And I thought, I like getting paid money to write. This is a good deal. We should take this. I started, I wound up shifting. There was another book that was sort of in progress theoretically, and we wound up deciding that, it would be better to have the sequel come out instead. It took a
Earlier.
lot
Yeah.
longer to write than I expected it to. So I was working on early drafts before Unkindness came out. I had a It was difficult for reasons of sequels are difficult. It was difficult for reasons of things that what happened in the world made things difficult. I had an early draft where the main plot line happening was a magical plague set in New York City
Oh,
that made it very difficult for people to breathe if it affected them. And I had an entire draft about the time there was an actual plague hitting New York City that made it difficult for people to breathe, and I realized I couldn't
you were
write that
hoping to
book.
write fiction instead of
Yeah,
nonfiction. Yeah.
yeah. So that went away, and I started again from scratch. And so, like I said, it took
The
it
very
took a
first place I ever heard the word pandemic was from a Connie Willis novel.
uh, oh yeah, yeah, yeah. So yeah, sometimes I would yeah, this was not supposed to be near future science fiction. This was supposed to be fantasy.
Yeah.
So um so yeah, so that was there
Fantasy
there
with a
was
heart.
Yeah. Something like that. So
So what other projects you said that you put aside a project in order to write this?
I did, and it's not being resurrected, so that one is just
Oh,
chapters and drawers. Because I will be writing something better, not because of
okay.
not for any bad reason, just for just
The
as
next book
time.
is always going to be a better book,
Yes,
right?
yes. As
That's
time
the way
passed
these
and
things
and
work.
and I thought about things, I realized that that was not the direction that I wanted to go, and I will have something much more entertaining for everyone.
Yeah. Now, how's about your short stories and your short work? Which I'm just this has to do with being a host of a radio show that featured short stories for the most part when it was 2 hours long or longer, and so I've always been a huge short story fan, and I love the novels as well. But I wonder how it is for you. Do you have a preference for short works over long works?
I really don't have a preference. It's all about sort of how the idea feels in my head. And I've actually, I've been working a little bit more in short fiction recently, and so I've had 3 pieces no, excuse me, I've had 2 pieces come out so far this year, and I expect there to be another 2, by the end of the year, so it'll be a good year for me with short fiction as well, which is really nice, and it's something I do still love writing and still love working in.
Hmm. How is there a manner in which it is different to craft?
I think for me, there's a couple things that are different. I'm much more likely to try something new or be experimental in my short fiction because for the very reason that it's short. So if I try something that like I had one of the pieces that I had come out this year is in Sunday Morning Transport, and it's a pretty short story. It's under 2,000 words. It's written in fragments. It's written in second person present, um, which is not how I would ever consider trying to write or structure a novel. It would probably drive
Mhm.
me insane to try and write it, and it would almost certainly drive a reader insane to try and read it, something like that at novel length. But for a couple thousand words, okay, yeah, I can hold somebody in doing something a little bit strange for that long. Some of it is like I said, how much accumulated weight the idea has in my brain, and so I sit there thinking about it. I think, okay, do I have enough to expand this into a novel-sized world? Can I bring people in these different subplots and things like that, or is this an idea that would be better if I focused it down and told it in 3, 4, 5,000 words? So,
Okay. Speaking of short fiction, I should just mention that our engineer, Barbara Krasnoff, has a piece in the current issue of FNSF,
oh,
Magazine
cool.
of Fantasy and Science Fiction. So, yay.
That is
Um,
great. Yeah,
yeah, yeah, and it's a good market to break into.
it certainly is. That's a terrific magazine.
Yeah. Now we have 2 questions I'm just
Okay.
noticing, and, the first one, comes from our, dog's buddy, as she likes to call herself, Amy Goldschlager, and she asks, "How would a contemporary magical book set in the Twin Cities be different" ooh, this is a good question, "than one set in New York City?"
Well, so for me, I think if you're going to do a magic that's specifically set, if it's set in a specific city for the reason of the character of that city, then yes, you're really right that there's going to be a huge difference, and it's going to come into sort of the character of the cities, and what is it like to live there, and what is it like to what kind of magic would fit in well. I'm not sure if I would ever set a book here in the Twin Cities because for me, sort of the quintessential Magic Twin Cities novel is Emma Bull's War for the Oaks,
Yeah.
which is just so perfectly set
I
here.
love that book, but I had forgotten that it was, I'd
Yeah.
forgotten the city setting.
Yeah, and it for me, it's like the places that she names and stuff like that. Like I still, if I'm there, I kind of half walk by expecting the Fae to sort of maybe be off in a corner somewhere, and she does that book so well that I'm just like, nope, somebody already, I would be afraid to try, because even it would never live up to my love of that book in my own head.
It's a wonderful book. I should reread it. And for those who missed it, Emma Bull,
Hmm.
Bull, War for the Oaks,
For the Oaks, yes.
for the Oaks, right? Absolutely. And it's funny because at the time that I started reading An Unkindness of Strangers, I started watching, although it's been on streaming for a while, Russian Doll, Natasha
Mm.
Leone's show, and that is also not only New York specific, but it's like a 15 block radius
Right.
of the Lower East Side, part of which is mentioned in An Unkindness of Magicians. And I was thinking, oh, okay, this is on this side of the street, and that's happening on that side of the
Yeah.
street.
Could you imagine the crossover episode?
Yes, exactly. I can. So maybe you should get in touch with. Well, there has to be a third season of that series. Although now that Poker Face is such a big hit, she's probably going to be tied up with that for a while.
Yeah.
Okay, somebody else had a question.
Mhm.
John Gladstone Gelman asks, is House of Shadows a shout out to your DC Comics background that made me think of House of Mystery?
It is not. I actually
We can put
had
these on screen.
I had
I'm
written an
sorry, go on.
unkindness. That's okay. Okay, sure. I had written Unkindness of Magicians before DC got in touch about working on comics with them. Obviously, I had read Sandman comics before, and I know what the House of Mystery is and things like that. But no, it's not a DC comic shout out. It's because the familial magic in the unseen world, the families are part of are part of houses. They've organized themselves in that way, and so the House of Shadows, even though it was not directly an inherited house necessarily, without getting into details that are explained in the books, just got that name because it fit with House Prospero and House Merlin and House D. So
And I asked you this during the Hour of the Wolf session that we did, but I thought that this audience deserved the question again, which is when you have House Prospero and all that, these aren't actually descendants
no,
of
no, what they're
Prospero
yeah, they're claiming
Merlin.
they're claiming a link that that fit well for them, but this is there's no one in House Merlin is descended from Merlin from the Arthurian mythos or anything like that. They were just that was a affinity that the
Uh-huh.
founder had.
Yeah. No, I just wanted to make it clear for
Yep.
this audience as well, because initially when I was reading An Unkindness, I thought, ooh, Prospero.
There was actually, when I was very first drafting, there was a very brief moment when I was thinking about going in that direction, and then I realized that would complicate my life in ways that I was not looking to complicate it at that point. So
Yeah, and I'm glad that you ended up not going there, that it
yeah.
just ended up being honorifics,
Yeah.
as it were, because, yeah, exactly, it would complicate things and cause, oh my God, would you have to, if you didn't have spin offs, people would be doing fanfic based
Right.
on, and that could still happen.
They're welcome to.
Ah,
Absolutely.
don't say that. Joe Monty wouldn't want you to say that. Uh,
As long as it's just fanfic, it's fine.
okay. Now, Amy comments, but there's so much room for New York City magic. I don't see why other places can't get more magic for magical happenings.
I think that they can. I would never mean to say that I wouldn't read another Twin Cities magic book, or that people shouldn't do that. I just meant in terms of in my own writing of where I might choose to set a book or things like that. It would be very hard for me to imagine a magical Twin Cities on my own without thinking, oh, but Emma Bull has already
But
done this in a
Emma's
way
been
that I
there.
loved.
Yeah.
Yes, yes, yes. But this I do, this is I love living here, and I definitely think there are very interesting magics that could happen here, just not for me to write.
Okay. Well, get some magic to resurrect Uncle Hugo's.
That one, although I think that they are back.
Oh, are they fully back now?
I'm pretty
Oh,
sure,
I'm
yeah.
glad to hear that.
Yeah.
I'm very pleased to hear that after the tragedy that befell it
Yeah, no,
during
it's such a
the
great community bookstore. So,
yeah. I was there once. I was in Minneapolis twice, I guess, for mini cons because I
mhm.
liked mini cons. A lot of fun. Very special convention, unlike others, I might say.
Hmm.
And the touring you do in Minneapolis is that you're walking around, somebody says, okay, this is the corner where Mary Tyler Moore throws her hat.
Yep.
And then you go to see Uncle Hugo's. To which, yes, I should have remembered that it exists because Barbara and I donated some books to the store when her brother was living in Minneapolis
Oh, okay. Yeah.
until about a month ago.
Hmm.
He's going to Jersey. Okay. Oh, Pennsylvania. He's on the borderline. I keep
Ah.
saying Jersey. I don't know why. But irrelevant
It's
to
fun to
this.
say.
What other cities would you imagine to be great magical cities? I don't know why, but I think Paris.
I was just that Paris, I mean, London, I think has definitely got a great tradition of magic and myth in it. I love Peter Ackroyd is a historian and a novelist, but I really love he did this marvelous thick London biography that's just got detail after detail of the city in there, and I feel like that would be great. Um,
Mm.
I don't, I think Joe Monty should send me on a European tour so I can figure this out.
There we go. There we go. Yeah.
you know,
Joe, you're listening?
I will consider other sequels at that point.
Very good. Yeah. Um, there are cities I can think of staying away from right now, but uh, Paris would not necessarily, or London would not be one of them. I think almost any city that's a walking city.
Yes, yeah, I think there's something about being able to know it under your feet, and then there's the great mythological traditions of walking the bounds or walking magic. A city is labyrinth or something like that. And I think you're exactly right that they need to be places where you can walk. If somebody's going to prove me wrong and write some great magical novel about driving their car through suburbia or something like that, which also good.
Mhm. Uh, Amy has another question.
Okay.
Have you ever listened to your own work? How do you think audio transforms your work?
I listen to very brief chunks, just because it is very surreal for me to listen to something that is my own work. I'll listen for to hear the narrative voice or something like that. But I don't sit down and listen to it like I would if I were listening to someone else's audiobook or audio fiction or something like that. But I think that it is really just I was very happy with Madeline Maybe's narration, and I think that just that the ability to sort of immerse yourself into a book that an audio version gives you is really pleasant, and is something that I'm really grateful in terms of of the accessibility of audiobooks and
Mhm.
having that format of story.
Yeah. Well, you're preaching to the choir there because I I edit six podcasts of speculative fiction a month.
Yeah,
I
yeah, and
host
it's
two.
great that there's so much out there.
Yeah, it really is. Clark's World does a great job with it, and a
Mhm.
couple of other places. Jim Capio says Ian Sinclair is when it goes in the screen. It's much larger type, easier for me. Ian Sinclair is the one for London psychogeography.
Okay, thank you.
A lot of psychos in Whitechapel, anyway. Uh, I did love London. Barbara and I were there for about 10 days on a business trip when we were both working for the same company. She for one magazine and I for the online
Mhm,
version. And when she was busy with meetings and stuff, I just walked London.
mhm,
And it's like New York. You can't get to a street or corner without going, oh my God, I remember such and such here. I remember
mhm.
this pavilion at the London Zoo in that book,
Right.
things like that. It just, and then of course, we did not go to the fake Baker Street address, but we did go to Charles Dickens' house, his
Oh,
townhouse.
that's marvelous. Yeah, I love that sort of thing, seeing
Yeah,
that
it
that.
was really good. The two main authors we've done is Dickens and Louisa May Alcott
Ah, lovely.
up in Massachusetts.
Mhm,
Used to be close to ReaderCon, so it was a great um, thing to do. Go a day early and see the site for Little Women,
yep.
and then delve into a convention.
Yeah, when I lived in New Hampshire, I remember the first time that I was visiting my parents in New Hampshire. My dad was driving me home from the airport, and we drove past this exit that was like Robert Frost's farm this way, and I was like, "Whoa, Robert Frost's
Whoa!
farm!" And the place, the place where they live in New Hampshire, really does walking through there really does feel like walking through a Robert Frost poem. So
Wow! Yeah,
yeah.
I was. I spent time in New Hampshire and Maine before I was 10 years old, so I don't remember it that well. But I have
Mhm.
images and a feel for the feel of the place.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it was my childhood. I had a great time there. And what other places have you lived? And what other places might you want to live?
Let's see. I was born in Chicago, and lived there till second grade. I grew up out in the Pacific Northwest, about an hour south of Seattle, and I loved that. I would be very happy to go back there. Um, Spent time in Florida and Texas, and then up here in the Twin Cities. And then, like as I said before, I was out on Long Island for a couple of years, and I've been around a lot.
Yeah. Uh, we have two comments,
Okay.
or a comment. I'm going to go to the second one first from Amy Goldschlager because it's on target with what we're just talking about.
Mhm.
Rachel Pollack's Unquenchable Fire is a magical Poughkeepsie. It's doable. And by the way, hats off to Rachel Pollack, who was a reader for us some years ago, and just a neat, wonderful person. I knew her both through the science fiction circles and, believe it or not, through tarot circles.
I was gonna say I've got her tarot book on a research pile behind me right now. So that's I
Ah,
haven't I don't I'm not familiar with her fiction yet, but her tarot work is just amazing. Just
for me,
yeah,
it was
such a loss.
Yeah, really. And for me, it was the other way around. I knew her for her fiction because I met her at various places. But my best friend and the person who created Hour of the Wolf is Margot Adler.
Mm-hmm.
And if you know the name Rachel
Yes.
Pollack, you may well know the name Margot Adler.
Also on my research pile, yes.
Yes, and her book was another. Between those two, I would say people get a good sense of what the craft
Yeah.
is really about. Um, Now we had a question before that. Thank you, John Gladstone Gelman. I think we associate old magic with older cities. What would a magical story look like in a city without such roots? I'm thinking of Dayton, Ohio.
Yeah, I mean
I'm
I
thinking of Singapore.
I can't speak to Dayton specifically as I haven't been there, but I think that's part of the fun of choosing a place when you're thinking about setting is, if you want to write that story, if you want to think about, okay, what does magic look like in this place? As I said, you need to think about the character of the city and what it means to live there, to walk through there, to grow up there, the good parts and the bad parts. What is steeped in the city's soil, what is part of the city's history, all of those things. If there's going to be a magic inherent to that city, I think all of those things are going to go into building and shaping what the magic is. um, uh, Max Gladstone's most recent, not his most recent book, but Last Exit, sort of does some of that
Mhm.
with, travel across America and things like that. And what does magic look like in these places that are sort of younger, what we think of as younger cities, or without these deep roots, or things like that, or just the different kind of city being an influence on the different kinds of magic. And I think he does that really, really well.
Yeah, I knew somebody who lived and grew up pretty much in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, and then came to New York City. And her immediate reaction is, everything's so old.
Well, and I think, some of it too is, what do we think of as cities and things like that? Because certainly, there are, older civilizations in these places. They're not necessarily what we think of as, what would immediately spring to mind as a modern city. So it's also a question of, whose magic are you going to show? What kind
Hmm.
of magic and things like that. Again, when we think of the history, we want to be careful and think of the entire history of the place, and not just, the past 100 years or 200 years or whatever that's looked like as well.
There used
So
to be great cities along the Silk Road,
yeah, yeah, exactly. So
and that would be a great place to set some fantasy and or science fiction.
yeah.
Let me just remind people, although we've been putting it on screen, that if you want to ask questions and you're watching on either Facebook or YouTube, you go to the comments area and just type in your comment or your question, and Amy will pull it out and give it to Barbara, who will give it to me, who will give it to Kat. So, it's, I wouldn't say it's watered down about 4 times,
It is
but
it is handled very carefully as befits a sacred object.
yes, exactly, exactly. And I'm sure there's a lot of chit chat among people because they're all waving at each other. And by the way, folks, I mean, I know there's a lot of hi Jim and stuff like that. And well, I'm doing this, so I can't respond now. I'll respond like, midnight tonight. I'll come in and do the whole thing. Can you tell us what you are working on now?
I no.
Okay,
I tend to be very, very superstitious about works in progress.
a lot of
Some of it
writers, they
some of
prefer
it is
not to
for a
disclose it.
craft reason. The more I tell the story, the more I articulate it, I tend to feel like I've already told it, and so that I don't need to put it down on the page. And so I lose things by talking about them too much. And so I try not to do that. Other than, it is a novel length thing. The novel length thing
Mhm.
is fantasy, and I'm just gonna that is all I'm going to share for now. I'm sorry for giving a
Well,
frustrating
well,
answer.
well, let's just swap one word. I'm used to that answer. I know writers, this is something that they're shaping, and that
Mhm.
shape could change, and they don't want to be beholden. And also, it's
There's also
still
that,
too,
yes.
it's too internal.
Yes, yeah. I mean, once I have it in draft and I'm in revision, then I'm more likely to chat and share details. Partially because I have more of the sense of the shape of the thing. I'm also I don't outline. I don't do any kind of organized anything. I'm very much a write by my headlights sort of writer, and so, until I have a first draft, I don't even really know how to tell you what the book is about. So,
So Amy has saved us here by changing
hurrah!
the word writing to
Hmm.
reading.
Oh,
Okay.
I'm always happy to talk about what I'm reading. I'm reading Mary Renault, who is a wonderful historical fiction, sometimes with a little fantasy tinge in there. Her book, The Last of the Wine, which I realized the other day
Hmm.
when I was looking for something to read, I was like, oh, I have an unread Mary Renault on my shelf. This is absolutely what I want to read, and I am enjoying that terrifically. Um, uh, some nonfiction for research, and then I always have some poetry going on, and there's a new set of Seamus Heaney's
Ooh.
translations out, which is just this big, gorgeous stuff that I didn't even know was that he had done. And he is a favorite poet of mine, and so that is also something that I pick up pretty regularly right now.
Hmm. Okay. What about here's a terrible question, non-prose stories? Has there been any, in other words, movies, media,
Mm.
games,
I'm
which,
not a game person. I let's see. I am watching my the TV show that I'm kind of watching right now is Ted Lasso, like a lot of us. And let's see. Am I? Um, yeah, that's I have been very head down in book publicity, and so I am a little less caught
of
up on
course,
media than I normally would be.
yeah, yeah, and though media takes time.
Yes, yeah, and I like to be able to actually really sit down and pay attention. I don't have like a, I can't work with like, oh, here's the television show on in the background kind of thing. So I just sit down and, and when I can actually concentrate.
Yeah, I have websites for that. Um, nature websites usually.
Hmm.
And Amy mentions that she's just started Mrs. Davis, and it
Oh,
is
right, that's
bonkers.
the Betty Gilpin TV show. I've
Yeah,
heard good things about that one. I want to watch The Diplomat pretty soon too. So.
yeah, those are both on my list. And but you have to subscribe. I had subscribed to Peacock, which is where
Hmm.
Mrs. Davis lives, and I had dropped it the day before I heard
No.
of Mrs. Davis, which we should mention to people. Mrs. Davis is an AI, and we
Okay,
won't
yeah.
go. And the story stars a nun, so do not be misled by that. It sounds uh, very deal. Yes, actually, Amy says that she got a deal where Peacock was $1 a month for the next year. I got like $1 a month for 3 or 4 months, which was long enough to watch the show I had intended to, Poker Face, which I mentioned earlier. But
Mhm.
I'll get back there. I don't have Apple, which is doing a lot of science fiction
Right.
um, with strong attempts, not always successful. And then for slumming, there's Disney.
Yeah,
Although
I tend
sometimes it's good.
I tend to, subscribe and binge everything for a month and then switch to the next one, and yeah.
Yeah, I think we're going to move to that model because it just costs way too much to take a whole package, and we're not even paying for um, a cable thing. We use
Mhm.
YouTube TV, which
Right.
is good enough. And it's from there that I get all my nature websites.
There
Oh,
you
and
go.
what is it that I have to tell people about? I am not a cat person, but
Okay.
having said that, on YouTube, Tiny Kittens, one word. Uh, it's basically a rescue home,
Oh,
and there are two cats there that have recently given birth. So the kittens are now about 10 days old.
okay, so we're gonna have to stop this interview now so that I can go watch the Tiny Kitten channel.
Yeah, and they're and when the lead vet comes in and takes care of them. It's like you don't have to be a cat person. You become one for at least the duration.
Yeah,
Otherwise,
I am a cat person, although we might be having some weather this evening, so both of my cats are in hiding just in case.
yeah, yeah. I used to have them, and when we had weather, they were all under the same couch, with one of them beating up on all the others.
Oh.
Let's see. Amy has there's there's a
Wacky one with timeshares on the moon.
there's a wacky one with timeshares on the moon. I don't know what we are on Apple TV. Oh, that's a series. I thought we were still talking about nature websites, and that would be a real interesting, real life website for timeshare, and that's the name of it. That's the whole name. Timeshares on the moon. Yep, that would do it. Joe, are you listening? That's a good novel title as well, or a series of, or even better, a collection by different writers,
Yeah, there you go. Yeah,
and
that's
that's their
that's
premise.
definitely an
Timeshares on the moon.
anthology.
Yes, exactly. It's a themed anthology with exactly that idea. And if each writer can be told who the various characters who live on the moon are, they can
Right.
interact.
Yeah, or we can just do them sequentially. So somebody's got the timeshare in January and somebody's got it in February and
Yeah. And the title of the series, I have not heard of the Tiny Kittens on the Moon. That's a thought. Uh, all of them, except all they do is sleep half the time, but they do tend to float around a little. But Amy also says the actual series is called Hello Tomorrow. Anybody looking for it? And it's got Hank Azaria, and he's been doing a lot of live action lately. I've noticed he's got like 2 or 3 things that are currently new
Mm-hmm.
on TV, and I'm pleased for that. Okay. Um, Gee, I'm using Barbara's computer here, and I do not know what it means when there's a J jumping up and down, sort of like waving at me. That's my name's
Ignore it.
Jim. Say what?
Ignore it.
Ignore. I will ignore it. Except I like seeing my initials just sort of like bounce up and say hi. But having said that, we are also, um, yeah, at 8:08. Last time
Okay.
we did this, we ran for 90 minutes,
Yep.
and we should probably not try to break that record because also I'd like to get you back real soon.
That'd be great. I'd be delighted.
Yeah. Any plans on visiting New York in the next year or so?
Not
Visit
immediate
your
plan.
editor?
Yeah. If that happens, I will definitely let you know though.
Yeah, by all means. Although I've been doing the radio
Right.
show remotely as we did, even if I'm just doing it in New York. I went
Right.
into the station live last night. We won't get into it.
But yes, I'm happy to visit virtually, and I will let you know if I'm there physically as well.
Yeah. And Jim Capio says dinosaurs on the spaceship, and Amy chides him saying, "Of course, we all know that's a Doctor Who episode." And we won't even get into snakes on a plane. So,
No, thank you.
yes, but that could be PLAIN, although I'm sure there are plenty of snakes on that plane.
Hmm.
Anything you would like to say to folk as we start to sign off for the evening?
Just thank you so much for having me, and for those of you who asked questions, I really appreciate it. The book is out now. They make fantastic gifts for everyone in your life. You should buy at least 6 copies.
Minimum, yes.
Yeah.
And yes, we have an URL that we developed from Amazon.com that gives us a kickback
There you go.
And that's to your page, not to any one of the specific books. But you can get both an Unkindness of Magicians and a Sleight of Shadows. And Joe, yeah, there should be an Unseen World duology box set by all
I think so
these.
too. Yes.
Yeah, you've got time now to get it out for the holidays. Which holidays? I'm not saying.
Any of them.
Any of them. Yeah. Yeah. Simaf Torah, that'll be just fine. Uh, and oh yes, I need to thank people. I need to thank your publicist. Normally, I meet people at conventions or different ways and I get them onto the radio show or whatever here. But in this case, your publicist, whose name is escaping me,
Cassidy, who is fabulous and
Cassidy
absolutely worth
Settler,
her weight in gold.
she is wonderful. Even though we started talking about 3 or 4 months ago, she was checking up with me today. Was there anything that we needed? She did great stuff. We have to thank Joe Monte for making these books possible in the
Absolutely.
first place. We have to thank Barbara Krasnoff for engineering.
Mhm.
And we have to thank Amy Goldschlager for wrestling all the great viewers.
Absolutely. And so many good questions. Thank you, everyone, so much.
Okay, well, thank you, Kat. It has once again, for the second time in a month, been a delight. I should mention, by the way, that if people go to watch this on YouTube, they will see both your interviews together.
Excellent. Thank
This
you.
one will take about 2 hours to come alive. Takes a little while for them to germinate. But once they do, they are there to be seen.
Great. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you, Kat. And thank you, everyone. Have a good evening. And, ooh.
Oh, that's weird.
Oh, that's fun. Let's put up all the screens. I think we just put up the 2 books
Okay.
on a 2-screen split. There we go. I like the way those 2 books.
Yeah, we got great cover work.